Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another one of our Why I Do Not Believe Bible studies in Shady Ministries. Today we're going to be discussing Buddhism, and while it may not be as prevalent among English-speaking or Western cultures, it is still a topic worth noting because sadly it is a topic, a religion, a belief system around a majority of Eastern mysticism beliefs that is, quite frankly, given a lot more credit than it should. So what I want to do here today is to simply lay out point blank and essentially by the same standards we've been holding other non-Christian cult groups and other beliefs that claim to be an extension or fulfillment of Christianity, and hold Buddhism to the same standard that we would any other belief system. And instead of holding it to a biblical premise in which it claims no association, I'm instead going to be holding it and beginning this study to a standard given forward in Scripture that just because something looks good doesn't mean that it is. 2 Corinthians chapter 11, verse 13. For such are false apostles, deceitful workers, transforming themselves into apostles of Christ. And no wonder, for Satan himself transforms himself into an angel of light. Therefore it is no great thing if his ministers also transform themselves into ministers of righteousness, whose end will be according to their works. Essentially, Paul's standard here for a false teacher isn't that they'll be spouting off Anton LaVey sermons and saying that essentially we're all to, grow horns and paint ourselves red and act like a bunch of imps until we ultimately stand for it on Judgment Day. No, they're going to be a little bit more subtle than that. And understanding that is the nature of anything evil, that it's not necessarily something that looks poisonous that's the most dangerous, it's something that has poison hidden within that you need to be the most careful about. And that's why we're going to be holding Buddhism to the standards we've been holding any other belief system to. And you can take a note that this will be the only time I'll be citing the Bible in all of this because, quite frankly, as an alternative to this belief system, I can just stand on Buddhism's own beliefs to refute it. And this isn't ultimately going to be some scholarly pursuit. I did do quite a lot of reading in order to prepare for this, going through the teachings of the Buddha as well as an introductory to the prince's life and history. But understand the reason why I'm saying all of these things. I'm not doing this to condemn Buddhists. I'm here to point out Buddhism has flaws. It has problems, both factually and practically. And it's based on this information that I would like you to reconsider where you're ultimately putting your confidence for salvation, for the afterlife, for your purpose that's been given in this life. Because especially given the fact that when Buddhism, Hinduism, any of the Eastern religions are put into practice, people have not only suffered but died. And ironically enough, they were founded on the principle of avoiding these things. And it's not just to say that any belief system that would be true would preclude you from suffering. Far from it. Christians suffered more than any other. But the point is, I don't want you suffering for something that is ultimately what I can verify as misguided. And that's where I'd like to begin. So the standard we're going to hold any belief system to, which includes Jehovah's Witnesses, Mormons, Muslims, we're also going to hold to Buddhists, and also by extension Hindus, but Buddhism has a little bit more verifiable history behind it, so we'll start here. Buddhism is going to be held to the standards of consistency, coherency, and clarity. But before we get into these three, I'd like to discuss a little bit of history. Buddhism was founded based on the teachings of a prince that was born in the highest class of the Hindu caste system. And this was ultimately what caused him to be raised in a life of luxury, according to Buddhism, A Concise Introduction by Houston Smith and Philip Noyvik. I encourage you to read that on your own time. But basically being showered in luxury and prosperity and being withheld from any form of suffering or harm, this was ultimately his upbringing, his perspective and roots on life. And this prince was raised by his parents based on a fortune teller's prediction that he would either cause a great spiritual revival or he would cause a great military rise in his father's kingdom. Naturally, the father wanting the latter, he chose to raise his son absent from any form of suffering. Now, it was ultimately when he was introduced to suffering by seeing 4 different sights. The first was an old man, the second was a dying man, the third was a dead man, and the last was a poor beggar. He was given examples of age, disease, death, and poverty. He began to look into the topic of suffering since he had never encountered it before, and this obsession essentially grew and developed, where he chose to leave his wife and his son in order to find enlightenment about this topic of suffering. First, he pursued philosophy. Then after that, meditation. And finally, he joined an ascetic cult, which asceticism means to withhold yourself voluntarily from bodily needs. I guess the best way to compare it would be Stoic philosophy for the Greeks, saying essentially that feelings and the absence of all such is the true pursuit and noblest ideal in life. And therefore, it was ultimately when he was able to demonstrate a more passionate pursuit than his fellow Hindus. According to some records, he said that he would live off of 6 grains of rice a day, starving himself nearly to death, to show how passionate he was in rejecting this idea of suffering by voluntarily making himself a part of it. But all these things ultimately ended up leaving him in want. That wasn't enough for him to understand this topic of suffering, let alone a solution to it. And so after going under what was called the Bodhi tree, he was meditating and there discovered the Eightfold Path. And that was ultimately what he claimed was the means to enlightenment from suffering and into the afterlife, which we'll detail here in a moment. And what he ultimately continued to teach and gather followers around him to until the time of his death when he was 80 years old. The founder's name was, and pardon my pronunciation, I'll be using these Hindu terms but speaking from them in an American accent, so you can forgive me, but it was Siddhartha Gautama. And he was born around 563 BC. We aren't exactly sure on that, but essentially all of these things that would confirm this individual's life and teachings are narrowed down to these claims of belief: that first and foremost, the universe is eternal. I need to emphasize that point because it will be important later as far as holding Buddhism to a standard of coherency. But on top of that, not only that the universe is eternal, that it essentially is God, the origin and source of all life, but in order to become one with the universe, that's the overall goal of Buddhism, much like Hinduism, but in a different way, you must follow what are known as the Four Noble Truths and the Eightfold Path, which are the following. The Four Noble Truths are: 1, that suffering is what's wrong with the universe. They would use this term dukkha to describe it. 2, desire is what leads to suffering. 3, abandoning all desire is freedom from suffering, and that's what's called nirvana, by the way. And abandoning all desire, the fourth noble truth, is done through the Eightfold Path. So a Buddhist recognizes this. Desire is wrong, suffering is wrong, desire leads to suffering, so abandoning desire means abandoning suffering, and abandoning suffering is the goal of my purpose on this earth. That's the assumption of Buddhism. Now, how is that done practically? Well, it's through the Eightfold Path. The first of the Eightfold Path would be the right view, to adopt Buddha's perspective on suffering in the afterlife. The second is the right intention, to adopt Buddha's motives on removing suffering and pursuing nirvana, so to assume that he's right. Third is the right speech, to adopt Buddha's standards for proper speech. 4 is the right action, to adopt Buddha's morals and ideal human behavior. 5 is the right livelihood, to adopt Buddha's goals in serving bodily or communal needs only at a complete absence to oneself. 6 is the right effort, to adopt Buddha's balance in what you do and why. 7 is the right mindfulness, to adopt Buddha's distinction between desire and duty. And lastly, the right concentration, to adopt Buddha's meditation habits, I guess is the simplest way to put it. And ultimately, all in line with all of these things, here's the method, here's the madness, but you are ultimately also given an infinite number of lifetimes to remove dukkha from what is called your enduring self, your Atman, through a process that is commonly known as reincarnation, or what they would call anatta. So all of these things being laid out, it's an interesting belief to be sure, but can it be held to the same standards that we would claim is a sound belief system? Well, firstly, with consistency, no. No, Buddhism and their concept of morality, The Buddhist concept of morality is one that no human being could ever practically live with. In page 62 of the Teaching of Buddha, I would like to read this quote for you. People make a distinction between good and evil, but good and evil do not exist separately. Those who are following the path to enlightenment recognize no such duality, and it leads them to neither praise the good nor condemn the evil, nor to despise the good and condone the evil. That sounds noble in a way, but understand page 53 coming right before this statement is essentially what this looks like in practice, and you need to see what this is will ultimately do to the human psyche. Same book, page 53. There is no discrimination between right and wrong, but people make a distinction for their own convenience. That's quite philosophical, but understand what that means practically. On the basis of this morality, a Buddhist, a truly enlightened individual, someone who's following their purpose for existence, cannot look at a death threat any more than they would a compliment. Now, maybe that doesn't mean all that much to you, but understand what that also means not just internally, but externally. You can't look at, for example, to use the most extreme scenario possible to make the finest point, a child's murder any more than you would observe a sunset. It is the universe. It is all that is. There is no distinction between right and wrong. This is just simply my dukkha talking and thinking that this child being killed is any different than just how light reflects off of the moisture and the shadow of the earth forming. Now, if this moral example recognizes no distinction to the enlightened, understand this is not something that anyone would live with practically. Is this just my dukkha talking, or is there a reason we recognize the difference between these two things? Is there such a standard as right, and therefore a proper definition of what is wrong? Secondly, is Buddhism as a belief coherent? Well, once again, I would say no. And the reason for that isn't one that I have to even reference biblically. Buddhism's assumption of the nature of the universe is scientifically impossible. What do I mean by that? What I mean is that it is impossible to cross an actual infinite. Therefore, time itself cannot exist. I guess the best way to illustrate this is, what if I sped up this video 4 times the normal speed? Well, in the editing process, that would turn 1 second into 1/4 of a second. The video would be 4 times faster. Now, take that logic then and imagine if I then slowed the video by 4 times. Well, then 1 second would become 4 seconds. The video would be 4 times longer. Now, take all of this basic understanding of how this mathematic would work, and then have me slow down the video by an infinite. Think about that for a second. If this video was to be slowed down by an infinite number of processes, that ultimately from start to finish, the ultimate distance between the two would be unending, then 1 second would be infinite seconds. And since it's impossible to traverse an actual infinite by its own definition, then this video would never be over. We would never finish 1 second of this conversation, even though there was a start and there was a finish. Because it's been stretched out to an infinite point, we would never get to a single moment. And therefore, because of this claim, we have to ask ourselves another question. If the universe is infinite, it's all it ever is, was, or ever is going to be, we need to ask, why is the beginning of the universe something that is so precluded? And even more importantly, why is the concept of a creator, the one who initiated creation, being so readily thrown out? Now, I know that there's the Hindu gods and goddesses. I know there's all these other things that were adopted by whatever the prince ultimately thought would be beneficial to his philosophy. But understand the point I'm making here. There is an effort to preclude origins. There is an effort to ignore the concept of not only creation, that our beginning had a purpose, but also that there will be an ultimate end in which we'll have to account for. And as noble a pursuit it was to try and remove the idea of suffering from a nation that was fraught with it, understanding that ignoring the problem does not result in a solution. That's not true biologically, that is not true mentally, and that is not true practically on any sense of the term. So understand the point that's being made here. Is this clear? Because the credibility of these theological and moral principles stands or falls on the teachings and integrity of one man, Prince Gautama, and him getting it right, we have to reject Buddhism, not just on the basis of these factual errors, not just because of these impractical codes, but most significantly that the claim to authority stands or falls on only his moral teachings. That's why I do not believe Buddhism. Now, normally this would be where the video ends, but this is where the practical is going to come in. Not only for my fellow Christians listening to this out of a desire and love to want to reach out to fellow Buddhists, but also for the opportunity for Buddhists listening to this to understand our perspective. You would probably counter that claim by saying, but wait, you believe in Jesus Christ. You believe that his moral teachings and his view of the afterlife is the basis and standard for all human morality. What makes him any different than Prince Gautama from the Buddha? Well, a historically verified resurrection from the dead is a start.